How Characters Reveal Our Inner Truths, Chapter 1. The Therapist's Dilemma Dr. Elena Vasquez closed the leather-bound journal with trembling fingers. For 15 years, she had listened to her patients pour their hearts out in this same oak-paneled office. But tonight something had shifted. Tonight, she realized that every story they told her was actually her own story, refracted through different voices, different faces, different wounds. The revelation had struck during her session with Marcus, a 38-year-old architect who couldn't finish buildings. As he described his fear of completion, his terror that anything finished would be judged and found wanting, Elena saw herself with startling clarity. How many papers had she left unwritten? How many relationships had she abandoned at the threshold of true intimacy? "Doctor," Marcus had asked, leaning forward in his chair. "Are you all right?" She wasn't all right. She was drowning in recognition. The storm outside rattled the windows of her downtown practice, but the real tempest was inside her mind. Elena had built her career on the premise that she could remain objective, clinical, separate from the human wreckage that washed up on her shores 5 days a week. But Marcus, sweet, broken Marcus with his unfinished blueprints and haunted eyes, had held up a mirror she couldn't look away from. Her phone buzzed. A text from her editor at Psychological Review. "Where's the article on narrative identity? Due tomorrow." Another unfinished thing. Another building without a roof. Elena stood and walked to the wall where she kept her degrees, her awards, her carefully curated proof of professional competence. But tonight, these achievements felt like elaborate disguises. Who was she when she stripped away the credentials, the clinical language, the protective distance of her role? She thought about her other patients. Sarah, the perfectionist who color-coded her calendar but couldn't make a decision without anxiety attacks. James, the comedian who made everyone laugh but hadn't felt genuine joy in years. Mrs. Chun, the grandmother who gave endlessly to others but believed she deserved nothing for herself. Were they all just facets of some larger human truth? Were they teaching her something about herself that she'd been too afraid to see? The rain intensified, drumming against the glass like impatient fingers. Elena opened her journal again and began to write. Day 1 of seeing clearly. My patients are not case studies. They are mirrors, and I have been staring at my own reflection for 15 years without knowing it. Chapter 2. The writer's block 3 floors above Elena's practice. Novelist David Chen stared at a blank document on his laptop screen. The cursor blinked mockingly at him, a digital heartbeat marking time he didn't have. His publisher expected the first draft of his new novel in 6 weeks, but David hadn't written a single usable sentence in 3 months. The problem wasn't inspiration. David had notebooks full of character sketches, plot outlines, and dialogue fragments. The problem was deeper, more unsettling. Every character he tried to create felt like a piece of himself he wasn't ready to examine. Every story he began led him down corridors in his own psyche that he'd spent years learning to avoid. His protagonist, Anna, was supposed to be a fearless war correspondent. But whenever David tried to write her scenes, she became paralyzed by doubt, just like him. His villain, Richard, was meant to be a manipulative corporate executive. Instead, he kept turning into a lonely man who pushed people away because he was terrified of being truly known. Again, just like David. Write what you know, his first creative writing teacher had said. But what if what you know is too painful to put on the page? David's phone rang. His mother. "Have you eaten today?" she asked without preamble. "Yes, Ma." A lie. He'd had coffee and whatever dignity remained from yesterday's takeout. "Are you writing?" "Yes, Ma." Another lie. "Good. Your grandmother always said stories choose their writers, not the other way around. Maybe this story isn't ready to be born yet." After she hung up, David sat in the growing darkness of his apartment, thinking about his grandmother's words. Stories choose their writers. What if the characters he couldn't write were choosing not to exist because he wasn't ready to face what they represented? He opened a new document and typed, "What if our characters know us better than we know ourselves?" The words appeared on the screen like magic, and for the first time in months, David felt the electric thrill of a story beginning to emerge from the darkness. Chapter 3. The reader's discovery in a coffee shop 6 blocks away. Maya Rodriguez was discovering something disturbing about herself through the pages of a romance novel. She'd picked up Hearts in Collision as mindless entertainment during her lunch break from the law firm where she worked 60-hour weeks. But the heroine, Lily, kept making choices that made Maya want to scream. Lily was brilliant, accomplished, and attractive, yet she consistently chose the wrong man. She fell for the charming commitment phobe instead of the steady, loving best friend. She sabotaged her own happiness with suspicious, defensive reactions to genuine affection. She built walls so high that love couldn't climb over them. "She's an idiot," Maya muttered, earning a glance from the barista. But even as she criticized Lily's choices, Maya felt an uncomfortable recognition stirring in her chest. How many times had she done exactly the same thing? How many good relationships had she destroyed with her assumption that everyone would eventually leave her anyway? Maya thought about Tom, her coworker who'd asked her out 3 times in the past month. Tom, with his easy smile and patient persistence, who brought her coffee when she worked late and remembered that she liked extra foam. Tom, whom she'd rejected each time because… Why? Because he was too nice? Because nice guys were boring? Or because letting someone that kind get close felt like handing them a loaded weapon? She flipped ahead in the book, skimming until she found Lily's final chapter. The heroine had realized her pattern of self-sabotage and was fighting to change it. She was choosing vulnerability over safety, love over fear. Maya closed the book and stared at her reflection in the coffee shop window. When had she become someone who was afraid of kindness? When had she decided that love was something that happened to other people, fictional people, people who were braver than she was? Her phone buzzed. A text from Tom. "Working late again? I could bring dinner." For the first time in her adult life, Maya typed back, "Yes, that would be nice." Chapter 4. The Convergence DR. Elena Vasquez had been walking the streets for an hour when she found herself standing outside the Paper Moon, a small bookstore cafe where she'd never been before. Through the rain-streaked window, she could see people reading, writing, talking in low voices over steaming cups. It looked warm and alive in a way her sterile office never did. She pushed through the door, shaking rain from her coat, and immediately collided with a man carrying a stack of books. "I'm so sorry," she said, helping him gather the scattered volumes. "No harm done," he replied. "I'm David. David Chun. Elena Vasquez." She handed him the last book, a collection of short stories, and their fingers brushed. Something passed between them, a recognition that neither could name. "Are you a writer?" Elena asked, gesturing to the stack of books. "Trying to be." "You, therapist." "Also trying to be." David smiled. "We're both in the business of stories, then. You listen to them. I try to write them. And lately I'm discovering that the stories we tell and the stories we live might be the same thing." Before David could respond, a young woman at a nearby table looked up from her book. "Sorry to interrupt," she said, "but I couldn't help overhearing. I'm Maya, and I think I'm having the same revelation. About stories, I mean." Elena and David turned to her, and suddenly the 3 strangers were sitting at the same small table, sharing something that felt larger than coincidence. "I spend my days listening to people's stories," Elena said. "And today I realized that every story they tell me is somehow my story too. My patients aren't separate from me. They're showing me parts of myself I've been afraid to see." David nodded vigorously. "Yes, I've been trying to write a novel for months, but every character I create just turns into me. Different versions of me, different fears and hopes and wounds. It's like they refuse to be anyone else." Maya held up her romance novel. "And I've been reading about this woman who keeps making the same relationship mistakes I make. Except seeing it from the outside, I can finally see how destructive the pattern is. She's teaching me something about myself that I couldn't learn any other way." The 3 of them sat in silence for a moment, each processing the strange synchronicity of their meeting. "What if," Elena said slowly, "what if this is how it works? What if the characters we encounter, whether we're reading them, writing them, or listening to them, are actually messengers, mirrors that show us truths about ourselves we can't see directly, like a psychological function of narrative?" David added. "We don't just tell stories to entertain ourselves. We tell them to understand ourselves." Maya leaned forward, and the stories we're drawn to, the characters who fascinate or frustrate us, they're probably reflecting something we need to work through. Outside, the storm was beginning to clear, but inside the coffee shop, a different kind of illumination was taking place. 3 strangers were discovering that their individual revelations were part of something larger, a fundamental truth about how human beings use story to navigate the complexities of their inner lives. Chapter 5. The Patient's Truth. The next morning, Elena sat across from Marcus in her office with new eyes. Instead of seeing him as a case study to be analyzed, she saw him as a teacher who had been trying to show her something essential about the human condition. "Marcus," she said, "tell me about the building you most want to finish but can't." He looked surprised by the directness of her question. Usually, she approached his architectural anxiety more obliquely. "There's this house," he said. "I've been designing it for 3 years. It's for my sister and her family. Every time I get close to completing the plans, I find another flaw, another thing that needs to be perfect. She's been living in a cramped apartment, waiting for me to finish, and I can't. What would happen if you gave her the imperfect plans? She might build it and be disappointed. She might realize I'm not as good as she thinks I am." Elena felt the familiar tug of recognition. "Marcus, what would happen if you gave me imperfect therapy? If you knew I was flawed, struggling, uncertain about my own life?" He blinked, clearly not expecting the question to turn back on her. I guess I trust you more. If you were human instead of perfect." The words hung in the air between them. Elena realized she'd spent 15 years trying to be the perfect therapist, the one with all the answers, the one who never struggled. But Marcus, broken, scared Marcus, was showing her that perfection was a prison, not a goal. "Marcus, I think you've been trying to teach me something for months. About the courage it takes to be imperfect in front of people we love. About how our flaws might actually be what makes us trustworthy." Tears began to form in his eyes. "Are you saying you understand? Really understand? I'm saying that you've shown me my own fear of being seen as imperfect. And maybe that's exactly what I needed to learn." For the first time in their therapeutic relationship, Elena felt like they were two human beings helping each other rather than doctor and patient. The artificial distance collapsed, and something real took its place. Chapter 6. The character's rebellion. David sat at his laptop, but this time he wasn't staring at a blank page. Anna, his war correspondent protagonist, had finally begun to speak to him, but she wasn't saying what he expected. "You keep trying to make me fearless," she wrote through his fingers, "but fear is what makes me human. Fear is what makes me brave." David stopped typing. His characters had never talked back to him before. "You want me to be the woman you think you should be," Anna continued. "Bold, confident, never doubting myself. But that's not who either of us is it?" "This is crazy," David muttered to his empty apartment. "I'm arguing with my own imagination. What if crazy is just another word for breakthrough?" Anna wrote, "What if the stories that scare us are the ones we most need to tell?" David found himself typing Anna's story, but it wasn't the story he'd planned. This Anna was afraid, terrified, actually, of the war zone she entered. But she went anyway, because her fear told her that what she was doing mattered. Her courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite fear. As he wrote, David realized Anna was teaching him something profound. He'd spent his whole life waiting to feel brave enough to live fully, to love deeply, to write honestly. But Anna was showing him that bravery wasn't a feeling. It was a choice you made while feeling afraid. His phone rang. Sarah, the woman he'd been seeing casually for 6 months, the woman he'd been too scared to get serious with. "David, I know this is sudden, but I need to know where this is going. I can't keep pretending I don't care about you when I do." In the past, David would have panicked, made excuses, found a way to retreat. But Anna's voice was still in his head. "Fear is what makes me brave." "Sarah," he said, his heart hammering, "I'm scared of how much I care about you. I'm scared of messing this up, but I don't want to run away anymore." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then, "Thank you for telling me the truth." As they made plans to have dinner and a real conversation about their relationship, David looked back at his computer screen. Anna had written one more line. Sometimes our characters know exactly what we need to hear. Chapter 7. The Reader's Choice. Maya stood outside Tom's apartment building, holding a bottle of wine and fighting every instinct that told her to run. She'd read 3 more chapters of Hearts in Collision during her lunch break, and Lily's transformation was forcing Maya to confront her own patterns with uncomfortable clarity. In Chapter 15. Lily had finally admitted to herself that she chose unavailable men because being rejected by someone emotionally distant hurt less than being rejected by someone who truly knew her. The insight had hit Maya like a physical blow. How many times had she pursued men who couldn't love her properly? then used their inevitable failure as evidence that she was unlovable. Tom opened the door before she could knock. "I saw you standing there for 5 minutes," he said with a gentle smile. "Were you planning to come up, or are you conducting some kind of sidewalk reconnaissance?" "I was thinking about running away," Maya said honestly. "What stopped you?" Maya held up the romance novel. "This is going to sound insane, but this book, this character, she's been showing me how I sabotage my own happiness. And I don't want to do that anymore." Tom stepped aside to let her in. His apartment was warm, lived in, full of books and plants and evidence of a person who had built a real life rather than just surviving day to day. "Tell me about her," Tom said, settling onto the couch beside her. "This character who's been giving you revelations." Maya found herself explaining Lily's journey. How the fictional woman's struggles with intimacy and trust had illuminated Maya's own defensive patterns. Tom listened without judgment, asking questions that showed he was really hearing her. "It's like she's been holding up a mirror," Maya said, "showing me how I look from the outside when I push people away. And what do you see when you look in that mirror?" Maya took a breath. This was the moment she usually ran from. The moment when someone asked her to be real instead of clever, vulnerable instead of safe. "I see someone who's so afraid of being hurt that she hurts herself first. Someone who's convinced that everyone will leave eventually, so she makes sure they do." Tom reached over and took her hand. "What if you're wrong? What if some people stay?" For the first time in years, Maya allowed herself to consider the possibility that she might be worth staying for. The fictional Lily had made that choice in Chapter 16, to believe she deserved love and to act like someone who did. Maybe it was time for Maya to write her own Chapter 16. "I'd like to find out," she said. Chapter 8. The intersection. 2 weeks later, the three unlikely friends met again at the Paper Moon. It had become a ritual, this weekly gathering where they shared their discoveries about the strange relationship between stories and self-knowledge. Elena arrived first, looking different somehow, less armored, more present. She'd started being more honest with her patients about her own struggles. And the artificial distance that had defined her practice for 15 years was dissolving into something more genuine and healing. David came in shaking rain from his coat, but his eyes were bright with the satisfaction of someone who'd been writing well. Anna's story was pouring out of him now, raw and honest and more powerful than anything he'd written before. More importantly, he was learning to live with the same courage he was giving his protagonist. Maya was the last to arrive, holding hands with a man they'd never met but immediately recognized as significant. "This is Tom," she said, and the quiet happiness in her voice told them everything they needed to know about how her story was unfolding. As they settled around their usual table, Elena pulled out a notebook. "I've been thinking about what we discovered that first night. About characters as mirrors, as teachers, as parts of ourselves we need to integrate. I've been writing about it," David said. "Anna keeps telling me things I didn't know I knew. It's like she's wiser than I am, even though she came from my imagination. Maybe wisdom isn't something we possess," Maya said. "Maybe it's something we access through story, through seeing ourselves reflected in characters who can be braver than we are, more honest than we are, more loving than we are." Tom, who had been listening quietly, leaned forward. "I'm not a writer or a therapist or even much of a reader," he said, "but I think I understand what you're talking about. We all have these stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we're capable of. But sometimes we need to see those stories from the outside, through characters, through other people's eyes, before we can change them." Elena nodded. "In therapy, we call it externalization. When you can see your problems as separate from your identity, as stories you're telling rather than truths about who you are, they become things you can change. And in writing," David added, "characters often know things the writer doesn't know yet. They make choices we're not ready to make, say things we're not ready to say. They lead us toward our own growth." Maya looked around the table at these people who had become so important to her life. What if this is how we evolve as human beings? Through story? Through seeing ourselves reflected in characters who can show us possibilities we can't imagine on our own. The conversation continued for hours, weaving between personal revelations and philosophical insights. They talked about the characters who had changed them, the stories that had broken them open, the ways narrative shaped not just how they understood themselves, but how they lived. As the evening wound down, Elena made a proposal. "What if we wrote about this? All of us, together? What if we told the story of how stories change us? And so began the collaboration that would become their book. Part memoir, part psychology, part creative exploration of the mysterious relationship between the stories we tell and the lives we live. Epilogue. The truth we've always known. 6 months later, Elena, David, and Maya sat in the same coffee shop where they'd first met, but everything had changed. Elena's practice had transformed into something more collaborative and honest. David's novel about Anna the Fearless because frightened war correspondent had found a publisher. Maya and Tom were planning their wedding, a celebration of her decision to choose love over fear. Their book, Mirror Souls, How Characters Reveal Our Inner Truths, was being published the following month. But more than the professional success, what mattered was the personal transformation they'd undergone through the process of examining their relationship with story. "I keep thinking about what you said that first night," Maya said to Elena, "about your patients being mirrors. I think we're all mirrors for each other. Every person we meet, every character we encounter, every story that moves us, they're all reflecting something back to us." Elena smiled. "And maybe that's the point. Maybe we're not meant to figure ourselves out in isolation. Maybe we need the whole chorus of human experience, real and fictional, to show us who we are and who we might become." David closed his laptop, where he'd been working on his next novel. "I used to think writing was about creating characters from scratch. Now I understand that characters already exist inside us, waiting to be discovered. Writing is more like archaeology than architecture, or like therapy," Elena said, "uncovering what's already there rather than imposing what we think should be there." As they prepared to leave, each heading back to lives that had been fundamentally changed by their understanding of story's role in self-discovery, Maya asked the question that had been hovering over their friendship from the beginning. "Do you think we would have found these truths about ourselves without the characters? Without the stories?" They considered this in comfortable silence, watching the evening crowd of readers and writers and dreamers fill the coffee shop around them. "Maybe," Elena said finally, "but it would have taken much longer, and it would have been much lonelier." David nodded. "Characters give us permission to explore parts of ourselves we might not have the courage to examine directly. They let us practice being different, being braver, being more honest. They let us rehearse for the people we want to become," Maya added as they walked out into the evening air, each carrying the books that had brought them together and the stories that had changed them. They carried with them a truth that felt both revolutionary and ancient. We are not alone in our becoming. Every story we encounter, every character who moves us, every narrative that breaks us open is part of a vast conversation about what it means to be human. Characters don't just entertain us, they transform us. One recognition at a time, one mirror held up to our souls at a time, one possibility imagined at a time. In the end, perhaps that's what stories are for, not to help us escape our lives, but to help us live them more fully, more bravely, more truthfully. Our characters know us better than we know ourselves, and they're waiting patiently for us to catch up.